Well, I just got through listening to the speech of Donald Trump before the United Nations. I must say that it was gratifying to see some comments that we have not heard out of a president of the United States for decades, particularly when it comes to the term sovereignty and that sort of thing. But I think I would have given a little different speech to the United Nations. I would have stood up in front of them and said, I hereby am announcing the withdrawal of the United States from the United Nations and giving you a specific time to vacate the premises and leave the country. We are sick and tired of your diplomats using the streets of New York to disobey our laws and call it diplomatic immunity. We are sick and tired of financing bureaucrats in bloated salaries that are communists, socialists, and pedophiles. We're just sick and tired of the sort of thing that you've been trying to impose on the American people since it was founded back in the late 40s. Ladies and gentlemen, we always have to remember one axiom by Lord Acton, that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. When you bring nations together and they start to lose their sovereignty and they are beholden to this new international organization, the power structure that is formed is astronomical. It will, in and of itself, even if it started on the right footing, become corrupt. That is the nature of government. That's human nature. And so we can't get involved in organizations that put our Constitution and the freedom of the American people on the chopping block. There are several things that we're involved in with the United Nations, regardless of whether Trump says we can work with them or not, that are a very big danger to our Constitution. And let's concentrate on that for a moment, because this is the week we celebrate Constitution Day, isn't it? A 200-year-old document, over 200 years. In fact, I'll compliment Trump on that. He said it's the oldest Constitution in use. The reason is because our founding fathers based it on human nature and the nature of government, and they understood history. And they knew how to limit government to maintain the freedom of the American people. But in our book, International Merger by Foreign Entanglements, we go down through a litany of agreements that we've made with the United Nations that actually amends our Constitution in a way, because in practice, it may not alter the words in the Constitution, but it alters how we run our government. And it's being run by this international organization. For instance, we have a Bill of Rights. We say that government shall not pass certain laws concerning freedom of speech, assembly, so on and so forth. The right of the people to keep and bear arms, and all down through the 10 amendments that comprise the Bill of Rights. But if you look at the fundamental rights, these have already been abrogated by our agreement with the United Nations through their Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. In these instances, it says you have all these rights, except we can pass laws to make sure that it doesn't go against the beliefs and principles of the United Nations. In other words, you can say anything you want, just don't say anything against the UN. You can meet and assemble and talk about and organize for anything you want, just nothing against the United Nations. That is not free speech. That is not the freedom of assembly. They also, in banking, economics, and monetary policy, we have controls through the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the United Nations Economic and Social Council. In the way of trade, the World Trade Organization. In industry, the United States Industrial Development Organization. In education, the United Nations Children's Fund, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, where these particular organizations are coming right into the schoolrooms of our local schools and telling them how they should teach. Now, there's not a direct line. Nobody comes to the United Nations and goes to your local child's classroom. But through the policies within the United Nations, in their influence over publication, over our own government and everything else, is setting the standard for an international educational standard. through Common Core in this instance. And so the United Nations has a direct bearing on how your children are taught. And they are not taught to love our country. They are taught to love globalism and internationalism and put things like the United Nations above our own government. You might ask your own children about that, by the way, to see what kind of answers you get from them. Policies over women, policies over birth control and population through the United Nations Population Fund. Ownership of firearms. Many of you know that there is a statue outside the entrance to the United Nations in New York that shows a revolver that's got a twisted barrel into a knot. It's their symbol of trying to eliminate all firearms. And so through their United Nations Armed Trade Treaty and that sort of thing, they are trying to get every nation to outlaw privately held firearms. That's whether you're a hunter or whatever whatever reason you have a firearm in your house, simply to protect you, for instance, and your family. Totalitarian states do not want their people, their citizens, to be armed under any circumstances. So the United Nations is doing everything it can around the world to get governments to disarm their own population, including the population of the United States. This is wrong, and it violates the Second Amendment, does it not, to the Constitution. So on and on. The oceans and their tributaries to be controlled by the United Nations. What is a tributary? That's a river that flows into the ocean. So it isn't just simply the Gulf of Mexico, it's the Mississippi. It isn't simply the Pacific, it's the Columbia River, and so on and so forth. So they are gradually taking control over many of the things that we deem our own property. You can go on and on. Courts, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, where they say that these supersede our own Supreme Court, our own federal courts, our own state and local courts. And you can do the same with agriculture. You can do the same with the environment, even down to tourism. And so we see that by being involved in the United Nations, it's a direct attack on our liberties under the Constitution of the United States. These treaties, almost all of them that we've signed, have something to do with limiting our Constitution and imposing outside laws on the United States. Keep in mind there are 193 nations in the United Nations. And almost every one of them is a socialist nation, and even communist. I even like the words that Trump said about socialism. You might go and listen to the entire speech and catch that snippet. But nonetheless, we should get out of the United Nations. Don't say they're a nice group. They were started out with a noble purpose, because if you come to the Shop JBS site of the John Birch Society, you'll find all sorts of information on the United Nations. And you can order them and read them, and hopefully pass them on to friends and neighbors. Until next time, we'll see you then.